however briefly I canter through the history of the county, I can't miss some of the other calamities and catastrophes which so affected it. And again, well, the Civil War you'll know about, but perhaps we too easily forget the extent to which Somerset was flattened by the effects of the Civil War. For the most part, South Somerset was loyal to Parliament. The towns, for the most part, were loyal to Somerset. On the rural margins, loyalty to the king remained stronger, but essentially Somerset was identified as a dissident place. And that dissidence found, or the reaction to that dissidence found reflection in the 3 bitter sieges of Taunton, the second of which has been likened to a mini Stalingrad, and in the terrible siege of Bridgewater too. Bridgewater doesn't often celebrate its Civil War history, but it has a very proud history. And it was held for the Royalists. The castle was held for the Royalists, and it was there that Christabella Wyndham, walking on the ramparts, the wife of the governor, the Lady Governess they called her because she was such a powerful character, raised her musket on seeing Oliver Cromwell the other side of the ramparts directing the siege, and fired the musket and managed to shoot the man standing next to him. She might have changed the whole course of English history, but she didn't quite. And the Monmouth Rebellion, which was essentially the aftershock of Somerset's reaction to the Civil War, and its sense that it was not prepared to be a Catholic, part of a Catholic country. They pledged their allegiance to the Protestant Duke of Monmouth. They marched with him to disaster at the battlefield at Sedgemoor in July 1685, and they paid the terrible penalty in the Great Hall of Taunton Castle in September that year, when Judge Jeffreys presided and sentenced 144 people to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But after that, a kind of silence descends. Internal strife, wars over politics and religion, for the most part, had been put behind them. The gentry could turn once more to their estates, rebuild their houses, set out their parks. And here is Nettlecombe Court, the home of the Trevelyan family, depicted in the 1790s. And here, the landscape gardens at Hesticombe, set out by Coppleston Moor Banfield from the 1750s onwards. It was a time of fantasy, when the real landscapes, as it were recreated into an Arcadian or paradisical form for the delectation of the wealthiest stratum of society and for their guests and visitors. We wander around Hesticombe now, having paid our entrance fee, but at least it is accessible to us. It wouldn't generally have been accessible to us in 1750. And of course, those immigrants to the county, those 2 dissident poets who wandered in one day with no one quite knowing who they were or what they were doing, and quietly, in Netherstowe and Little Foxton, reinvented the voice of English poetry in that volume called Lyrical Ballads. A volume which begins with perhaps the most famous poem in the English language, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And I was very, very pleased when watching it, again, out of a sense of its own identity and what mattered to it, about what its history was and what it meant, found the vision, the focus and the determination to raise the many thousands of pounds that it cost to have that statue of the ancient mariner cast in bronze and put on the esplanade. And now they've gone one further, because they recognised as well that Watchet was a place from which Cecil Sharp collected many of his most influential folk copies. And so Yankee Jack, one of the chief singers for Cecil Sharp, is now also cast in bronze and commemorated on the waterfront. And we do get some things right, however late in the day. We have now embraced Coleridge and the Coleridge story. We have invented the Coleridge way, but it was a long struggle actually. For years, for centuries, well for 200 years, West Somerset really regarded Coleridge as an aberration, as someone who they were suspicious of, who represented new ideas and a sophistication which was uncomfortable and unwelcome. But he's been embraced now with the Coleridge way, and I think that's a process which is continuing. And other heroes from that period, Hannah More, who with William Wilberforce visited the village of Cheddar in the late 18th century, was appalled by the poverty that she discovered there and the ignorance of the young people. And at Wilberforce's insistent suggestion, set up a series of schools for the young, which was a model for the education of poor people throughout the land. She was a person of her time, however. She didn't escape. She wasn't one of us in that sense, because she insisted that they should be taught to read, but not to write, because if they could write, they would get above their station, they would be in competition with the farmers who were the actual rulers of the parish. We smile at that, but actually we're trapped by our own preconceptions. It's just that we can't quite spot what they are at the moment. And of course, Orator Hunt, who spoke at St. Peter's Fields in Manchester in 1816. The Peterloo riots and massacres followed. He was put in prison, and instead of being imprisoned up north, he was imprisoned at Ilchester Jail. They thought that would just be safe and far away. But actually, he caused terrible trouble while he spent his time incarcerated. He accused the jailer of unspeakable crimes. He accused the regime of terrible cruelties. And as a result of his constant badgering and insistence, his insistence that this was not acceptable, Ilchester Jail was closed, and prison reform took a step forward. And we do forget our heroes. We forget Coleridge and Hannah More, or Thomas Young from Milverton, who discovered the three-theory colour of light, and the theory of the bending beam, and all those other wonderful things, and who translated the Rosetta Stone before Champlain. We forget this man, for example, John Hanning Speke from Jordan's in Ashfield, who almost exactly 150 years ago, in 1858, was the man who solved one of the greatest geographical mysteries of the earth, one that the Emperor Nero had tried to solve. He discovered the principal reservoir of the River Nile. It's a story that deserves to be celebrated much more than it is, and especially by us in Somerset. And who are these people, looking so stern and forbidding? Well, these were people who, from the 19th century onwards, decided that Somerset needed to be better understood, that we needed to dig in the ground and in the archives. We needed to value the evidences of the past and try to make a coherent story from them. These are early members of the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society. Standing in the middle is Harold St. George Gray, who was an early curator of the society and a pupil of Pitt Rivers. Next to him there on the left is Bligh Bond, the man who excavated Glastonbury Abbey, but who later was directed by spirit messages from dead monks and was sacked by Harold St. George Gray. They were later to be the most implacable enemies. It was the biggest scandal in Somerset archaeology. Not that there have been that many. In the front is Sir Edward Fry, the head of the chocolate-making family, and the father of Roger Fry, who arranged the first Impressionist exhibition in London, and others too. A very miscellaneous group of people, but all with a powerful sense that the past informed the future, the present and the future, and helped us to create the vision by which we must move forward in any generation. And a society which was rapidly changing in the 19th century, not just through ideas, through the Romantic movement and through science and Thomas Young, but through compulsory education for the young, Foster's Education Act of 1870. Here, the charity schools are replaced by a more systematic educational provision. And then in 1902, LEAs were set up. And in fact, the pattern has been established for a very long time. The late Victorian pattern of governance has been remarkably robust, however much it's changed in its details.